Good afternoon. My name is Howard Markell, and I am the director of the University of Michigan Center for the History of Medicine. I welcome you all to the 20th Annual Horace W. Davenport Memorial Lecture in the Medical Humanities. The Davenport Lecture is sponsored by the Center for the History of Medicine and named for the late Horace W. Davenport, who died in August 2005 at the age of 92. For 20 years, Dr. Davenport was chair of the University of Michigan's Department of Physiology from 1956 to 1978, and he was one of the world's preeminent gastric physiologists. His landmark studies led to the discovery and explanation of the mucosal barrier of the stomach, which when broken leads to injury, such as the case with peptic ulcers. After retiring from active faculty status in 1983 as an emeritus professor, Dr. Davenport continued his longtime interest in the history of physiology and medicine, devoting himself intensively to it as his major scholarly activity. He authored several historical studies, including a full-length history of the University of Michigan Medical School and a book on the life and teachings of Dr. George Dock. Today we honor Dr. Davenport with a particularly distinguished speaker, Powel Kazanjian, MD, Ph.D. He is the professor and chief of infectious diseases at the University of Michigan Medical School. He is also professor of history at the University of Michigan, where he teaches about the history of epidemics, the history of sexually transmitted diseases. He is a graduate of the University of Pennsylvania. That's where his bachelor's degree is from. Tufts University for his MD, Harvard for an MA, and the University of Michigan for his PhD. So he has a lot of letters after his name. He's written about the history of AIDS, syphilis, commercial botulism, plague, and the development of bacteriology in America. Most recently, he's the author of Frederick Novi and the Development of Bacteriology in Medicine. It's a superb study in which Dr. Kazanjian uses Novi's archived letters, his laboratory notebooks, lecture notes, and his published writings to examine his medical research and educational activities here at Michigan, and by extension, other key medical schools during a formative period in the history of modern medical science. I highly recommend you reading it. Today, we're fortunate to have Powel as our Davenport lecturer, and I'm confident we will all learn a great deal as he speaks on a topic of enormous importance during this pandemic, the persistence of contagious diseases. One housekeeping point, if you have questions, please write them down in the chat part of this Zoom platform. And then after Dr. Kazanjian is done, I will get back on the screen and read those questions to him, and so that we can try to get some of the questions answered. So without further ado, here is Dr. Kazanjian.
Howard, thank you so much for inviting me to give this talk. It's really an honor, and it's a privilege to present my ideas to you and the group, and I welcome the listeners to this talk. It's really, truly an honor to give it. And right now, we're in the midst of a pandemic. We are experiencing an unprecedented time in our life, just as this picture of the COVID virus has the individual who's housing it and hosting it has no immunity to the little spike proteins on the surface, the little rostrum of proteins, thereby giving its name corona. We have our experience for this seems unprecedented, and the history is a good way to provide some perspective for us. At the minimum, to give some commiseration and company, and hopefully to give some guidance. And in looking for historical analogs, I think it's reasonable to go way back to the first reported epidemic in history, the Athenian plague in 430 BCE in Athens. This is depicted about 2,000 years later by Michael Swartz, the neoclassicist in this painting. And Swartz, I think, captures the essence of an epidemic in the population. Here you see a picture in a piazza in a Greek city where there are many lifeless felled bodies. So right away, you get a sense of the numeric component of an epidemic. And that's what an epidemic means. It's more than the number of expected cases of an illness for over a certain period of time. And he certainly captures that with the strewn bodies in the forefront of the painting. But more than that, he captures the experience, I think, what it's like to live through a plague. And in the lower left hand, you see the lifeless body of the woman and the malnourished, undernourished, suckling infant who will soon die because she has no breast food. The crying person above, the grief, the anguish of the person pulling out their hair to the left. And people, you not only see this, but you can sense it. You can see people holding their noses throughout the painting with the stench that's troublesome. But then there's a narrative in the painting. The narrative is that your eye is drawn forward into the central figure with the physician who's looking off to the right-hand side away from the dead bodies. And the physician at that point, as we know from the documentation of Hippocrates, has no art to his avail, no medicine. So he's helpless. He can't really do anything to materially alter the course of this pandemic, this epidemic. So he turns from his rational medicine and points to the temple over his left shoulder. And there you see some people supplicating at the steps of the temple, others arising, and others also felling. So the supernatural and natural approaches to handling this epidemic are equally ineffective. And then in the central portion, you see the person in somewhat realizing this in hysterics, reaching both hands above the head. The enveloping scene is painted during a crepuscular moment at twilight. The sun is set and the shadows are coming over and the people in the light seem doomed. It's a painting that captures the unanticipated and uneasiness of living through a pandemic. And clearly, that's what we're experiencing today to some extent. With these daily updated, this was updated 2 days ago, notion of the widespread pandemic community nature of the disease, with over now 50 million global cases, 10 million United States cases with over 230,000 deaths. So it's an extraordinary spread of disease in our lifetime. And you can see on the right-hand side that the numbers of cases are continuing to climb in peaks or surges or however you would like them. And in that first little peak that we all experienced back in March and April, there was a shutdown, a complete shutdown of life. Closed were schools, theaters, bars and restaurants, and sports arenas. And we were isolated from each other, feeling somewhat depersonalized and dehumanized, devoid of our cultural sustenance. We couldn't gather to go to religious meetings and churches, intellectual pursuits at museums. And at the same time, we were overwhelmed with the surge of cases that overflowed from hospitals into tents with makeshift areas to provide care for people. This is a scene from Italy with not enough personal protection gear to protect the individuals. And coffins were strewn at crematories where the coffins overwhelmed the number of burial spots in various areas of the world. And we had indeed never seen and experienced anything like this on a biologic or cultural level before. And this is meanwhile while our elected officials had a dual response to biomedicine. On the one hand, there was an ignoring and a downplaying and a denial of the scientists' recommendation to avoid crowds and wear masks. But on the other hand, there was a confidence that biomedicine would deliver the pay dirt, the vaccines, the therapies. And our president was confident that that would happen. So there was an ambiguous relationship with biomedicine. But that relationship suited the narrative that was coming forth, that the pandemic wasn't our fault. It was the fault of our competitors, economically, China. And that absolved some of us implicitly from getting infected, because the implication was that if you're not Chinese, you may not get the disease. Now, it was never said, but that was one of the implications. And it wasn't so serious a disease, and even if it were, there were therapies. That was the narrative that this dual ambivalent view towards science unfolded. But one of the dangers of that narrative is that it galvanized a group of people to feel righteous in their discounting and disavowal of the scientists' recommendation to avoid large crowds. And legitimized by our government's model of behavior. They, in defiance, in the summertime, drove to a place in South Dakota and congregated without masks and without protective gears to make a point about how the recommendations of scientists were abridging and impinging on their personal rights and civil liberties. And when these individuals returned to their homeland, there were about over 200,000 of them. They then returned to their homes and spread them in their local communities. And notice in this picture that the spreading was not equal. It was done because it uncovered and unveiled a social disparity that then turned into a medical disparity. And that's that people who were economically of a lower class and people who were African American and Hispanic had jobs that could not be done remotely at home. They were essential workers and therefore exposed to COVID and therefore have a higher proportionate rate of COVID compared with the general population, and also had comorbidities and lived in areas where they couldn't separate from one another, and that allowed the disease to spread more widely. And we're now in the mature 10-month phase of the pandemic, with the disease involving virtually every state, rural, urban. Nobody's really immune to this, to being involved from the disease. And the numbers continue to climb, as you can see in the country, with over 100,000 new cases per day, and that continues to climb. Now, on the one hand, we're heartened because we have a new vaccine that looks very promising, working against that spike protein that we first started with, to protect individuals from getting infected. And then we also have the MBAB, the monoclonal antibody by Lilly, that looks promising in preventing severe disease of high-risk people once they're exposed. But we don't know whether there'll be enough of those products for mass distribution. And we don't know when the vaccine will be licensed for use, either with an early use authorization or a final licensure. And finally, we don't know how many people will trust the recommendations to be vaccinated. So if a vaccine is 90% effective and only 50% of the people take the vaccine, as was estimated from polls in the past month or two, that will give a protection level well below herd immunity And so the people will still be susceptible to developing disease. And we can only divine the future and try to divine it, but not really know how it's going to unfold. So that makes us really anxious. That makes us anxious with fear. Fear of what's going to unfold and how the pandemic will mature and unfold. We're uncertain about the trajectory, and we struggle with the idea, particularly not just healthcare workers, but everybody, that patients, loved ones, or they themselves are vulnerable to the virus. And here, I think, is where we feel that affinity with what Swerts painted back in 1670 of that fear of the unknown spreading of the pandemic. The difference, of course, is that we have biomedical tools that wasn't present, certainly in the Athenian plague. And for that reason, I think it's worthwhile to look towards other analogs historically to guide us, give us perspective as we deal with our pandemic. And there's two that I want to use in this talk. One is syphilis and the other is AIDS. The syphilis has been around for 500 years, and it's given, it started off in 1495 with migrating populations with both commerce and exploration. And it was originally apprehended, and ideas of causality were put forth as the outsider getting the illness, someone from another country. And the other country depended on where you were from. If you were French, like this particular depiction, you would say that it's a affliction of Italy, of Naples, which is how this was branded. And it was also thought to be due as a disease of sin, of promiscuity, and also a disease of sexual contact. Now, I'm not going to read too many quotes, but one I'm going to read from a physician, Fracastorius, who wrote about the disease, who said, quote, let me just get this. He said, "All things fly from the soft embraces of love, for nothing is more harmful than these. Fair Venus herself abhors this pestilence, which is only contracted when two bodies in close contact with each other become extremely heated, and now this happens in sexual intercourse." So this offered many avenues for treatment. One is the humoral fixing, and at that point, syphilis was thought to be due to an overabundance of phlegmatic countenance, of black bile. So it could be counteracted by dry heat, which you see the people applying in this oven. People could be ridiculed and pilloried for guilt and reproach for having sinned, or they could be separated so that they couldn't contact one another and have intimate contact with each other. And there was a social distancing that had a change in sort of cultural behavior at that time. And people stopped using common drinking cups. They stopped the greeting kiss, and they closed down public bath where there would be intimate contact. And that was the initial approach to syphilis over time. But as time evolved, new ideas came, new ways of thinking about knowledge and epistemology. Not metaphysical ideas that led to humoral imbalances, but actually using your senses and empiricism to form new knowledge. That came from during the scientific revolution and Francis Bacon during the Novum Organum, or the new method, in 1620, and then with John Locke and his On Human Understanding during the Enlightenment in 1671, where new knowledge could be made not by inheriting first axioms and deducing from them, but by using your observations and projecting onto blank slates, the tabula rasas, and creating new knowledge thereof. And this matured into the apogee of this form of new knowledge in the 19th century. It percolated and developed at that point. And then at that instance, there was a politically accepted way of creating new knowledge in medicine, and that was in the hospital system, where people during the Napoleonic Wars, this was in the new regime after the French Revolution, were housed in federally funded large hospitals, and experienced doctors would round on them with a retinue of residents as depicted here, trying to determine and see what was inside, try to experience what was inside the body through aids, stethoscopes, and other instruments of percussion, for example, to try to look in the body and locate disease, the origin of disease, the actual locus of disease itself. And then they would then correlate after this with the pathologic, gross, and microscopic determinations of disease. And this resulted in a switch in the idea and approach of disease causality, away from a more metaphysical idea of disease originating from within side and due to humoral imbalances, to an actual thing, a ontologic conception of disease that could be localized in the body and categorized nosologically thereafter. And this worked well for things like pneumonia, but what about a multi-system disease like syphilis? A disease that involved the skin, the blood vessels, the brain, the retina, the bones. Were these all separate causes, or were they from the same etiology? And this was the debate in the 19th century. And some pathologists like Virchow argued that they were all part of the same disease, the same etiology, inflammation from syphilis, and they were parasyphilitic manifestations. But when the germ theory came, there wasn't the technology to really determine whether an organism right away. It required new techniques and new technology. So it wasn't until the early 20th century that the dark field microscope was able to identify the pale thread, or treponema pallidum in Greek, that was present in the fluid coming from sores. Or as Aldred Worthen showed with his stains in the tissue section of post-mortem examinations of people who had died from syphilis, thereby showing a medically heralded event of how the empiricism could be shown to be a medical feat and a medical tour de force at the time by showing the single cause of a multi-system disease. But that's disease causality. What about diagnosis? Well, biomedicine at that point, or scientific medicine based on empiricism and experience, also was able to show, produce a positive blood test. Here using the organism to put in a patient's blood, and if it forms a clot or coagulates around the clot, a precipitate, that would be a positive Wassermann test. And that was of value because syphilis caused so many manifestations. It mimicked other diseases. It was called the great imitator by Osler and others. And it was nice to have verification with a positive blood. So not only could you be certain of your diagnosis, but now this led to possible treatments. And it was Paul Ehrlich working in Robert Koch's laboratory, which was government funded to try to find the cause and help prevent the spread of disease, of diseases that were troubling to politically and causing social problems like syphilis, where people were immobilized, unable to work, needing institution because of strokes and so forth, and heart disease. That there was a social and political imperative to fund research and provide research in the Koch Institute for chemotherapy. people had tried immunotherapy for syphilis, but it didn't work. There was no vaccine available for it. And Ehrlich thought that, gee, maybe we could turn around the idea of poisoning, and not poisoning a human, but poisoning the microbe in the human by tricking it, by using a stain or an aniline dye as a side chain to the poison or arsenical. And then chemically altering these side chains until you finally found a formula or compound that could treat the syphilis and heal the syphilis in an animal model without hurting the animal. And that's exactly what Ehrlich did. And it was heralded in the medical press at that time, and it got widespread public attention. Ehrlich himself made these quotes that are still this day resonate with us. He said, "No serum or vaccine can come near the beneficent slaughtering of the magic bullet compound 606. He just tried these compounds and against various compounds against rabbit models, and found this was the one that he called the magic bullet. Now, with therapy in hand and an accurate diagnostic test, this emboldened public health officials, such as Charles Chapin in Providence, to form venereal disease branches of public health offices in the 1910s, 1913s. And Chapin sought to change public health approach, not from an indiscriminate cleansing and sanitation of the environment to make the environment less vulnerable, to actually interrupting the contact point between the ecologic host or vector of the pathogen and the human itself. So, for example, for plague, it would be culling rats. Or for yellow fever, it would be capturing mosquitoes. It would be customized to the individual epidemic. And for syphilis, this meant actually testing people on a widespread basis and then treating those who were infected to reduce the disease in the population. But even though Chapin and Rosenau and other public health officials made this recommendation, the first attempts during World War I, another imperative time in the United States history to reduce syphilis, because you needed healthy troops during the war. So the government was motivated to find the cause and to treat syphilis, to reduce, to win the war. So we had healthy troops. But the first approach was not a scientific one. It was partially scientific, but it also included a social hygiene component, a moralistic view of the disease. The old moralistic ways of viewing the disease never went away with science. It persisted. And the approach was to sort of shame people, to make them feel reproachful, embarrassed about their behavior. And the idea was that this could be then used to not only eliminate promiscuity and reduce syphilis, but also restore the social evil of promiscuity in society and restore Victorian values. Now, at this point, there was also a course of public health measures done, and that included the involuntary incarceration of sex workers in cities during the time, actually thousands of them, to detain them so that the disease could be reduced. Now, this was coercive, it was heavy-handing, officious, and it didn't work. And public health officials after that realized it. And it was during civilian times in the 1930s, another period of time during civilian government, when there was an imperative to control syphilis, to reduce absenteeism in workers during the Great Depression, and to reduce the number of people who would have to go to houses and asylums for care of their debilitation, their neurologic problems and psychologic problems resulting from syphilis. And that was Thomas Perrin. And he wrote a book called The Shadow of the Land. The shadow, because we don't talk about it openly. It's in the background, it's a shadow. We need to talk about this disease, to destigmatize it. Why? So people can get tested. And so we can contact their partners and identify them and treat them. And if that's the case, then syphilis had the potential of being eradicated. And Perrin laid out in very public forums his 10-year plan to eradicate syphilis. And here you can see in his depiction on the right-hand side that if you're treated, you won't infect others in that middle ground, that middle depiction. So treatment would kill the spirochete. You can see the horizontal spirochete across the chest. Would kill the spirochete and render that person non-infectious, so there would be not horizontal or vertical transmission from a pregnant woman to the child. That was the idea of the proposal. And in order to do this, posters were permitted, where you can see that people of all sexes, races, were being tested to come out of that shadow. And in order for this to be effective, they needed complete surveillance and everybody to be tested and treated for this to be effective. And you can see the implication on the right that the treated person has his overalls on and is ready to work and be a contributing member to society, as opposed to the incapacitated person who's disabled on crutches and who's therefore not a contributing person in the view of this poster in society during a time when, during the Depression, when the work was needed and absenteeism was eschewed. And during wartime, of course, there was a need for, during World War II, for healthy troops to win the war. And if you weren't healthy, then you'd be abetting and siding and favoring and helping your enemies, Hitler and Hirohito. You would be unpatriotic. So it was patriotic to get treated for syphilis. This was a forceful message. And then by the late 40s, during civilian times, penicillin, a drug that could be given in one shot, what an allure, one shot to cure an old disease. Yes, it's old, 1495, and eliminate the risk from society. And this talks about the idea of another quote that I have of in this article that states that it may not be long before medical students would have to consult textbooks to obtain information about the disease. That's how confident they were that penicillin would help relegate syphilis into a disease of the past. Now, during this time, it's interesting, very interesting, that it's 1948 and the Tuskegee study is being conducted. And penicillin that doctors know is effective is being systematically withheld from a cohort of over 300 African Americans in a sharecropper condition in the South in the United States. So this would later spawn a mistrust, not at this time, but later, a mistrust of science. Well, eventually in the 1950s, the confidence blossomed. The confidence in penicillin to treat pneumonia, penicillin to treat syphilis, vaccine against polio that was effective, and in the 1960s, vaccines against other disease, into a confident narrative that epidemic diseases altogether might be a thing of the past. And this was articulated in multiple sectors of society. Creative writing, Bertrand Ruchet, medical writing, and in public textbooks. It was a widespread belief. And this is just depicted in this allegorical picture of where biomedicine here is equivalent to Hercules slaying the unpredictable forces of nature, the Hydra. Where here you can see it's the reverse of Swart's painting. Mankind, humankind is not at the mercy of the unpredictable forces of nature, but is the master of them. And this overconfident belief was really shattered by the appearance of AIDS as an epidemic in 1981. And this came right after the eradication of smallpox, so people were confident that laboratories' insights had relegated epidemics into a thing of the past, but that clearly wasn't the case that AIDS showed. And it described a sudden onset, sudden beginning of a devastating, frightening group of infections and tumors that occurred in healthy men who had homosexual behavior, and who also diseases that used to occur had previously occurred in severely decapacitated patients who were receiving, for example, immunotherapy to stave off rejection for organ transplants. And the disease involved male homosexuals. And the initial rhetoric from multiple members of society was that the disease was just retribution for sort of depravity of sinful behavior, and a stigmata of that stigma is easily seen on the Kaposi's sarcoma that would appear on the skin, easily recognized by a layperson. You didn't have to be a doctor to recognize it. And here people mistrusted the advice of the physician. Remember in COVID today how people mistrust advice of physicians. They mistrusted what the government said, what the CDC recommended on how the disease is spread. The CDC said it wasn't going to be spread casually. It would only be spread by intimate contact, but people didn't behave that way. They ostracized people with HIV. They isolated them. Doctors refused to provide care for them. Housekeepers and nurses would refuse to enter the room. I remember personally when housekeepers would put trays underneath doors, they would refuse to enter rooms. Families wouldn't invite members into holiday parties or take photographs with them. They were excluded. They were socially distanced. And the physicians' advice were mistrusted, and there was coercion as well. Coercion on the part of the medical doctors who, not medical doctors exclusively, but some members of society who recommended testing all HIV patients, all HIV individuals, and quarantining those who turned positive. Something that may have worked from an epidemiologic viewpoint, but was clearly a coercive, officious, heavy-handed, involuntary way of handling disease. Well, the disease was ignored by the government, by Reagan initially, who felt that it wasn't part of his constituency. So he didn't talk about it or try to focus on raising funds and supplying funds for research and treatment. And the disease, initial people were treated like lepers. But what happened was when Reagan refused to respond to it, and where people were treated like lepers and excluded from interaction and social interaction, patient representatives took it on their own to fight back and say, it's not this. whether a disease deserves funding or whether it matters, whether it deserves funding for research and care, shouldn't be up to the government alone. The government's biased. Reagan's biased. It's up for negotiation. It's up for contesting, and they contested it. They used their skillful theatrical way of getting the public limelight to protest and say that that HIV should be high on the agenda, in the government agenda. And they criticized doctors. They mistrusted doctors for being too slow and methodical in their research. How can you take so much time? How can you give placebos to our dying companions and take that period of time? And that's unnecessary. You need to rush your studies through. You have to do them quickly and find out whether these drugs work. Drugs into bodies was the mantra of what these people were chanting. And they would come to meetings and chant. I remember them coming and doing this. Well, the government responded. And the government funded research into AIDS. The first drugs that were produced were ineffective, AZT and the nucleoside agents. And people continued to die in a horrific way when that was touching and heartbreaking in spite of taking these drugs. And it wasn't until that this state endured and persisted until the mid-90s that a group of activists, of patient representatives, splintered off from the ACT UP group and said that the drugs aren't working because we're not studying them properly and because we have to go back and get more basic biologic information to look at viral targets and see which areas may be more effective and more potent, which area of the life cycle of the virus might be more potent. And they worked with scientists, they worked with pharmaceutical companies. The splinter group of ACT UP was called TAG, Treatment Activation Group. And they versed themselves well in science and medicine, even though they weren't scientists themselves. They became fluent in the language of science. And they worked with companies, pharmaceutical companies, to create something different than what Ehrlich did. And that's to actually identify the target virologically and three-dimensionally and chemically. And then from that target, three-dimensionally design a protein that would inhibit some of the viral proteins that were necessary for the virus to burst from the cell and reinfect other cells. One of these enzymes was called the protease enzyme, and the yellow molecule was called the protease inhibitor. And this is called rational chemistry. And it was a new form, a new process that was developed in response to a social and political need. This shows how there has to be a permissive social and political environment, and that results in scientific and medical advances. Well, these drugs reduce mortality. They were life-saving drugs. Here you can see mortality declining. Individuals went from fearsome to healthy appearing. And they were heralded as one of the breakthroughs of the year, not only in Science magazine, not only for HIV, but for all therapies. But in the process, they unearthed and they unveiled a social discrepancy, a social disparity, much like COVID has unveiled, and that syphilis will also unveil. And that's that the drugs were expensive, and people who were lived in areas where there were underdeveloped countries and resource-limited countries were unable to access them and afford them, and continued to die, and were being discriminated against simply because they couldn't afford the drugs. This wasn't socially just, and it wasn't humanitarian. These are the arguments by the four scholars who turned into social activists. And as a result of their activism and their persuasive abilities and personalities, they convinced donor countries to fund billions of dollars, particularly the United States, to increase in the allocation of the potent HIV medicines throughout the world. And they reduced the costs by lobbying with companies to change their intellectual property rights and reduce the number of years that a drug would have to remain on patent. And that increased and opened an avenue for getting generic forms of drugs. So suddenly the drugs became affordable to people throughout the year, throughout the globe. And this resulted in a greater distribution of antiretroviral therapy. So now as of 2016 and 2020, there are now 23 million people in the world, 23 of the 38 million people who have HIV in the world who are being treated. And it became clear that people were at risk for transmission early in the disease when their viral load was high and later when they had HIV. And this led investigators to say, well, gee, well, maybe if we can reduce the viral load to undetectable, maybe people will be untransmittable. That people through treatment could prevent infection, much the same theory that was the case with syphilis. And this was again another breakthrough of the year, that HIV could be shown to be, treatment could be used as prevention, when indeed it was shown that transmission with undetectable viral loads was non-existent, and it increased incrementally in relationship to the HIV viral load. And this led for politicians, Hillary Clinton at the time, to postulate an AIDS-free generation, but more specifically, an ambitious, so you can see this is a UN AIDS campaign called 90, meaning that 90% of the people who had HIV in the world would be tested. 90% of those would undergo treatment, and then 90% of those who are on treatment would become undetectable. And through this process, they laid out specific milestones and targets and dates to be reached so that AIDS and HIV could be eliminated as a threat by 2030. And that was amended in 2019 by President Trump to include and expand on PrEP, using PrEP to treat the uninfected people. So you can see that the biomedical advances and biomedical contributions, there was a lot of confidence in them. But what were the fate of these campaigns? The fate in Perrin's campaign, we left it dangling because I wanted to come back to it, is in the late 1960s that it failed. It initially succeeded in reducing rates. Remember, he said he wanted to reduce rates in 10 years. But then as government funding was rescinded as the rates declined, and more and more people were having difficulties with being tested, particularly people who were mistrustful of medicine, or people who were on the margins of society. That would mean at the time, people defined margins as teenagers, male homosexuals, felt uncomfortable about going forth and being identified, and would rather have been kept their disease secret. So there was a problem with testing. The moral judgment never went away. And people were afraid and reluctant to reveal the identity of their partners for the same reason. So by 1962, Surgeon General Terry had a new program to eradicate syphilis by appointing a task force led by Leona Baumgardner, who is the head of the New York City Health Department. And her goal was to, again, eliminate syphilis in 10 years. using basically the same format and the same program that Perrin did, this time addressing the difficult to reach groups that I mentioned before, and using the media to educate them, and getting officers who were better trained in contact tracing and treatment. Funding for that was obtained, but it failed too. And it failed because for the same reasons that Perrin's campaign failed. Baumgartner was able to identify some of these social determinants and some of these social factors that led to people not stepping forward, but she didn't offer any tangible solutions on how to capture them. And they were lost, and the disease continued to spread. In 1995, a new campaign called the National Plan to Eliminate Syphilis was begun, and that took off in 1999, and it was funded. They paid a lot of attention to groups such as groups with social disparities, educating other groups such as adolescents, male homosexuals, but it failed for the same reason. It was rehabilitated with a SEE, syphilis elimination effort in 2005, but that failed too. And as you can see, rates continue to climb. So now really the disease is rampant in the United States. There's over 40,000 cases, new cases a year, and over 6 million in the US, and over 6 million new cases a year in the world. But new programs are being developed, again, with the same plan to test and treat and pay attention to stigma and discrimination, as is seen below, disparities, and the social determinants of health. Again, it's people talking about them, recognizing the importance of these social plans, but not offering tangible solutions. And what about AIDS? AIDS, there's 38 million people in the world right now living with AIDS. The number of new infections has decreased by 40% from 1.6 million to 1.2 million. And that's because of the distribution, improvement in distribution of antiretrovirals. But the goals are far short of their mileposts in 2020. Right now, 72% of people should be on antiretroviral therapy with undetectable viral loads, and it's only about 54%. And that's across the globe. That doesn't pay enough attention to the groups that are not receiving access because they mistrust the government, they feel that, that there's too much stigma, or they simply can't because to get treatment might jeopardize their only way of getting income. If they're sex workers and they need to continue performing their job without using condoms, for example, or they don't have access to PrEP, they won't abide by the recommendations and enter into these programs. And I said that there was 1.2 million people with new infections in the world, but I wanted to look at deaths first. There's 1.6 million deaths in 2012. Now that's been reduced to about 800,000 because of the distribution of antiretrovirals. But remember that there are 800,000 people dying in the world where many of these deaths could be eliminated. This is a person in Africa who doesn't have access to HIV drugs, who has tuberculosis. And in terms of spread of the disease in the incidence, that's about 1.2 million cases a year. And again, not being diminished for a number of reasons. The goals aren't being met for a number of reasons. One is that structural problems. The stigma hasn't gone away. People aren't getting tested. Second is poverty. And people are unable to get the job opportunities they need, to get the professions they need, and people have to resort just to putting food on the table to resort to being sex workers when they don't have the means and the education or the income to do other things. That's what people resort to in areas in our country and throughout the world. High-risk jobs. And also structural interventions in places throughout the world where there are high-risk activities, such as in India, where people can get sex education, how to negotiate with your partner, how to change social structures so that women have equal stature to men and can negotiate with them, and be lectured by a peer group, a person who has credibility with them, another sex worker who's educating them about the importance of negotiating with your partners to use a condom or to get access to PrEP. Or with street outreach, to have needle kits and needle sharing devices, or to have people who can resonate with people with HIV so that they can convince them to not mistrust physicians and join in, be tested, be treated. And finally, mobile units to go to areas in rural areas where the drugs can be distributed. So in summary, what does this tell us? This tells us that biomedicine is very powerful. It's very strong in and by itself. It tends to create advances in certain permissive political times. But by itself, it's necessary. It's necessary, but it's not sufficient. And it must be accompanied by attempts to ameliorate and to rectify social problems and social illnesses and moral problems and political problems as well, and issues as well. That it's not enough, as Chapin wished, to interrupt the spread of the pathogen with the host. You must also pay attention to those broader environmental issues that create a vulnerable, susceptible environment. So it delimits biomedicine, the study of AIDS and syphilis and COVID. And it shifts the narrative of these diseases from having a sudden onset, a struggle, a devastation, to a defined ending, as hoped during the adolescent period of biomedicine, when the hopes were in the 1950s that it would end epidemics. And there may not be an end to them right away. They may persist in low levels. And our attempts to live with syphilis and reduce them in AIDS will be accompanied by not just these diseases, but by our attempts to reduce them in the population. COVID, the same thing. It's not going to be just a vaccine or a monoclonal antibody. You'll have to address poverty. You'll also have to address, that creates these disparities, and you'll have to address the mistrust that people have in the government and in science to wear masks and to take the vaccines. You'll have to address those social problems of mistrust. And finally, just to say that epidemics aren't going to go away. They're going to be part of our existence, whether they be COVID, HIV, or some other new illness, whether that's a mosquito-borne illness such as Zika or equine encephalitis. Our ability to prevent epidemic diseases are only to detect them in small numbers after they first emerged through computer systems. So it's reactive in nature. We can't really use big data to prevent epidemic diseases. They'll be part of our existence and part of our civilization as it unfolds. And with that, I'd like to thank you for your attention. And I'm sorry for going the full hour.
Well, I'll give as many claps as I can for that wonderful, wonderful talk. I was just thinking, by the way, as you were speaking, Paul, that you're giving the same lecture that Larry Kramer, Paul Farmer, and Anthony Fauci has given those lectures. So you not only are in good company, you are in equal company, and we're really grateful to you. I don't see any questions on the chat chart, but I think if you do have questions later, you can certainly email Dr. Kazanjian, who's here at University of Michigan. If anybody has a quick question to come up, we can take it, but we are at the hour point of our talk. Since I'm not saying anything, I'll adjourn, but I have a question, Powell, is that, particularly with the persistence of contagion, did this coronavirus pandemic surprise you? Whether it was this microbe or this process, what surprised you, given your long study of epidemics and pandemics?
Yeah, that's a great question. It did come as a surprise, right? Because people had postulated that a variant form of coronavirus, which you know is common cold type viruses, could come as a mutation and spread throughout the world. I think the thing that surprises me is how this happened and how rapidly it happened. How it happened during the Lunar New Year of China, before people could restrict international travel, and it's the extent to which it traveled and became community widespread in the communities of multiple nations before governments reacted to it. So scientifically and biologically, it's not a surprise. And it's not a surprise in how it spread in the pandemic, but it's the extent, it's more of an extent rather than the kind.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, germs travel. They really do travel. And
as you have written about eloquently.
Yeah, second edition coming out in December. And also the politicization of this pandemic is utterly incredible, I think. There is one here from Yoni Seiden. Syphilis and HIV are diseases of incredible shame because they're associated with sex. In what ways have the ways we treat COVID mirrored this experience of shame, and in what ways has it subverted it? That's a great question.
Yeah, no, that's a terrific question. And, I've given some thought to that, about what it is that shames people with COVID. And I don't think shame and the moral judgment is on the same par. I feel like the way we've treated it more shames us and shames the medical community than the patient. And that our treatments of the disease and our approaches to how it unfolds, how it's unfolded, these discrepancies of social and economic disparities. And so I think there's not as much as the moral opprobrium with COVID, but I do feel there is some element of shame. For example, an office worker or even a physician who becomes infected and doesn't want to stop working, because they're, and then they keep their status undercover because of that reason. And there are cases of that where that happens, but no, I don't feel like it's the same magnitude as it is with the sexually transmitted diseases. I think it's a different magnitude.
I think also too, Paul, is that you have to separate the word shame, particularly with sexually transmitted disease, from stigma, which are not necessarily the same. And there have been Asians who have felt stigmatized, particularly early in the pandemic. Asian Americans who felt stigmatized as they were the carriers or to blame for the pandemic. And of course, so-called funny nicknames for the virus were very widespread early in the pandemic until.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point. And I think that's the similarity. And you see that sort of blame of the outsider, of the other in syphilis, and you also saw it in AIDS, and you see it with COVID. That's where the similarity lies.
Yeah. Well, here's another question from Catherine Quantrum. Any predictions for the long-lasting effects on our collective psyche? I'm laughing because historians always get asked, what do you predict? And we like to spend our time in the past, but do you have any predictions, Paul?
No. It's a great question, and I can just speculate like anybody else. And And I think that I think that, some of this becomes personal when you think about your kids in school and how having them do learning at home is going to affect their development socially and intellectually at a young sort of, jejune age. I think that's on people's minds. I'm concerned more about the kids than the adults, but I do feel it's a problem for everybody.
Yeah, it really is it's really an earth-shaking event. One final point is that, as Dr. Kazanjian has said so nicely, I think, is that we have always lived with terrible epidemics, and we have always come through the other side. And so I think that's the hopeful part of this one, is that we will collectively get through this. But we may have scars and issues because of what happened. Let's just take one last question because we're getting late. It's from Patrick Potozak. Taking into account that HIV, SARS-CoV, and other infectious pathogens are thought to be zoonotic in origin, do you think that the human relationship with animals as food warrants further investigation or caution?
I think that's an interesting point. It's definitely true with HIV, which spilled over, if you will, from monkeys into humans. And, who knows what the origin of COVID is, whether it's bats. People don't think it was the pangolin, as was initially thought during the first part of the epidemic based on genomic sequencing. Eating and ingesting monkeys is thought to be part of the origin of HIV in Africa. That's a practice that increased over time in decolonized states with urbanization and building of roads. And that's thought to be, help the spillover, and then before it amplified with use of, sex work and travel and so forth. So I do feel like that's the case. And whether it's direct ingestion of an animal in COVID or just in proximity to them based on the businesses where the animals were bought, I think is speculative. But I do think that the type of animal, the type of wild animal eaten, maybe I think there's something to for HIV. Definitely, there's an association there, and possibly with COVID, and who knows with others.
Well, this gives us so much to think about, and I just want to thank, on behalf of the Center for the History of Medicine, the medical school, and Michigan Medicine, to have such a distinguished speaker for our Davenport lecture this year. Thank you, Dr. Kazanjian. Thank you so much. It was just a terrific job.
Howard, thank you for having me, and thank you for attending.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks, everyone, for coming, too.